Out in the dusty heart of Wyoming territory, the year is 1883, and a simple trip to the railway station for livestock and supplies is about to ignite a firestorm that will threaten to burn one man's entire world to the ground. Calder Holt had driven his wagon to town expecting nothing more than the breeding bull he'd ordered from Denver. He was a simple man, a quiet man, a man who'd lived alone for 15 long years after burying the love of his life. He kept to himself, worked his land, and asked for nothing. What he found instead was a woman. She was sitting on a weathered wooden bench, abandoned. Her traveling dress was wrinkled from waiting, her eyes holding that quiet, hollow desperation of someone who's run out of road. Her name was Rosalie Quinn. She was supposed to be a mail-order bride, another hopeful soul heading west for a new beginning. But her new beginning had died 3 weeks before her train even arrived. Her intended husband, a man named Harold Petton, was already in the ground, victim of a sudden heart attack. And nobody had bothered to send word. Nobody had thought to stop the train carrying his promised bride. So now she sat stranded, $17 to her name, a single carpet bag containing everything she owned, and a future that had just evaporated into the Wyoming dust. The townspeople whispered. They stared, but they offered no help. In their eyes, she was a complication, a burden, another mouth to feed in a land that was already hard enough. And that's when Calder Holt, a man who hadn't made an impulsive decision in a decade and a half, did something that would change everything. He looked at this stranger, this woman with quiet dignity and haunted green eyes, and he saw something he thought he'd buried forever. He saw a flicker of his late wife, Sarah. He saw a loneliness that mirrored his own. And in that moment, he decided to roll the dice on a long shot that would either save them both or get them both killed. What happens when two complete strangers, bound by nothing but circumstance and a shared, aching loneliness, decide to get married before the sun goes down? Before we dive back into this incredible story, do me a favor and tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. And if this story hits you right in the heart, make sure you're subscribed, because what's coming next, you won't want to miss. The bench where Rosalie sat had seen it all, but it had never seen anything like this. She clutched her bag, her knuckles white, the leather handle worn smooth from a 3-day journey of nervous hope. The letter in her pocket, the one from Harold Petton, was creased and torn from being read 100 times. It was a letter full of promises, a new life, a home, salvation from the grinding poverty that had pushed her to this desperate gamble. But Harold Petton was a ghost, and the town of Millbrook had no room for another charity case. Calder stood a few feet away, his worn boots planted in the dust. He was a tall man, lean and weathered by the sun and the wind. He was supposed to be picking up a bull, some flour, and the mail, a simple errand. Instead, he found himself staring at a problem he couldn't just walk away from. The woman's dress was a practical brown wool, mended at the cuffs, but it was clean. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple bun, a few strands escaping to frame a face that spoke of a hard life, but an unbroken spirit. She couldn't be more than 25, but her eyes held the weight of 100 years of disappointment. "Ma'am," Calder said, his voice a gentle baritone that startled her. He took off his hat, revealing hair the color of prairie grass in autumn, shot through with silver. "I'm Calder Holt. I own the ranch about 8 miles north of here." She looked up, and for the first time, he saw the deep, startling green of her eyes. "I'm Rosalie Quinn," she replied, her voice soft, with just a hint of an Irish lilt. "I suppose you've heard my story. Bad news travels like wildfire in a small town?" Calder just nodded. "Some of it. Enough to know you're in a tight spot." The afternoon sun was casting long shadows, and Calder felt a ghost stir within him, the memory of his Sarah, who died 5 winters ago from the lung fever that swept through the territory. It had left him in a house that was suddenly too big, too silent, a museum of a life that was over. He'd kept everything just as she'd left it, her sewing basket by the window, her favorite chair at the table. For 5 years he hadn't been living. He'd just been caretaking, preserving a past because he was too afraid to face the future. "I've been sitting here for 3 hours, Rosalie said, her voice flat, devoid of self-pity. It was just a fact. trying to figure out what comes next. The station master says there's a train east tomorrow morning. She paused, then looked him straight in the eye. The honesty of a person with nothing left to lose shining through. I used most of my money for the ticket to get here. I have $17 in what's in this bag. Calder glanced at the station house. He could see the faces pressed against the glass. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, and her circle of gossips, their heads bent together like vultures. He knew this town. He knew what they were saying. And he knew what they would do to a woman like Rosalie. They would chew her up and spit her out. And that's when the words came out of his mouth, surprising him as much as they would surprise her. "Miss Quinn," he said, his voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. "I have a proposition for you. It might sound unconventional." Rosalie's eyebrows rose, but she stayed silent, waiting. "My ranch is profitable. The house is sound. The land is good. I'm not a drinking man or a gambling man. I'm offering you a marriage of convenience, a roof over your head, security, and my name. In return, you'd help with the house. Nothing more unless you were inclined." The offer hung in the air between them, fragile and insane. Rosalie stared at him, searching his face for a trick, for some hidden, dark motive. All she saw was a man who looked as stunned by his own words as she was. "You don't know anything about me," she said finally. "I could be a thief, or worse." "Could be," Calder agreed, "but my gut tells me different. And I'm a good judge of character. Comes from years of dealing with livestock." A faint smile touched his lips, transforming his rugged features. "Besides, this town will eat you alive if you stay here alone and unmarried. A marriage, even a practical one, gives you protection. It gives you standing." The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in fiery colors. Rosalie thought of the letter, of the life that had been snatched away from her. The alternative was to go back east, defeated and disgraced. At least this was a chance. A crazy, desperate chance, but a chance nonetheless. "If I agreed," she said slowly, "what would be the terms?" "Separate rooms," Calder said immediately. "No expectations beyond what we agree on right here. You'd be free to leave any time. If it doesn't work, we part ways as friends. I'll give you enough money to get wherever you want to go." Rosalie looked around the depot one last time, at the whispering faces, the judging eyes. She rose from the bench, smoothing her worn skirt. "Mr. Holt," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I accept your unconventional proposition." Something shifted in Calder's chest. A door that had been rusted shut for 5 years creaked open. "The preacher lives just down the street," he said, offering her his arm. "If we're going to do this, we should do it properly, before sunset." As they walked away from the empty bench, a train whistle echoed across the plains, a sound of new journeys and new beginnings. But as Rosalie's hand rested lightly on his arm, Calder couldn't shake a sudden, chilling thought. He didn't know this woman at all. He didn't know what secrets she was carrying in that carpet bag, or what demons she was running from. He had just invited a complete stranger to be his wife, to live in his home. And he had no idea that he hadn't just saved her from a desperate situation. He had just stepped into the middle of hers, and the trouble heading for his quiet ranch was darker and more dangerous than any winter storm he had ever faced. The first morning was a study in awkward silence. The morning sun, slanting through the lace curtains of what had been Sarah's kitchen, seemed to highlight the vast, empty space between them. Rosalie moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of years of practice, her mother's cameo brooch pinned to her collar. It was one of the few things of value she owned, and she touched it unconsciously, a nervous habit. The wedding had been a blur, a quick, businesslike ceremony in the preacher's parlor. They'd ridden back to the ranch under a blanket of stars, the silence in the wagon heavy with unspoken questions. Now, in the harsh light of day, the reality of their arrangement settled in. "I found flour and bacon," Rosalie said, placing a plate of perfectly cooked eggs and biscuits in front of him. "I hope you don't mind." Calder stared at the plate. It had been 5 years since anyone had cooked for him. 5 years since a woman's touch had graced this kitchen. The simple act stirred something in him, something he wasn't ready to face. "It's fine," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. Rosalie sat across from him, her own plate holding a much smaller portion. A lifetime of making do with less had become an instinct. About the house, she began carefully. I noticed the bedroom upstairs. It looks like it hasn't been disturbed. Calder's fork froze. Sarah's room. Their room. It was exactly as she had left it 5 years ago. Her brush was still on the dresser. Her shawl was draped over the rocking chair. The book she'd been reading was still open to the page she'd marked with a pressed flower. I sleep downstairs, he said curtly. The room off the kitchen, you can have the upstairs. What he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that he hadn't slept in that bed since the night she died, that the scent of lavender on her pillow was a ghost that still haunted him. Rosalie saw the door slam shut in his eyes and wisely changed the subject. I'll need to understand the routine here. The ranch work. I'm not afraid of hard work. I'll teach you what you need to know, he said, relieved to be on safer ground. After breakfast, as Calder tended to the chores, Rosalie explored her new home. It was a good house, solidly built, but it felt frozen, suspended in time. In the parlor, she found a photograph of a smiling young woman with kind eyes and auburn hair. Sarah. There was a faint, superficial resemblance to herself, and a cold thought snaked into her mind. Was that why he'd chosen her? Because she was a pale echo of the woman he'd lost? In the pantry, pushed to the back of a high shelf, she found it. A wooden recipe box, beautifully crafted, with a floral design burned into the lid. Inside were dozens of cards, all in the same flowing, feminine script. Recipes for Sunday dinners, holiday treats, remedies for common ailments. They were more than recipes. They were love letters written in flour and sugar. Rosalie picked one up. Apple cake. At the bottom, a small note. Calder's favorite. Always make extra. The intimacy of it was a physical blow. She was an intruder, a stranger standing in a dead woman's kitchen, holding the remnants of a love she could never be a part of. The sound of boots on the porch startled her. She tried to put the box back, but a single card fluttered to the floor. She was bending to retrieve it just as Calder appeared in the doorway. He saw the recipe card in her hand. His eyes flickered to the pantry shelf, and his face hardened into a mask of stone. A wall went up, cold and impenetrable. I'm sorry, she stammered. I was just organizing. I found... Don't. The single word was a blade. Don't touch her things. The cold fury in his voice was a shock. This wasn't the kind, gentle man from the train station. This was a man consumed by a grief so deep it had turned to poison. I understand, she said softly, taking a step back. But he was already turning away, his shoulders rigid. I'll be in the barn, he said, without looking at her. Alone in the kitchen, Rosalie sank into a chair, the recipe card clutched in her hand. What had she done? She'd agreed to marry a stranger to find safety, but she'd walked into a house haunted by a ghost she couldn't possibly compete with. She thought of her own past, the locked doors and painful secrets she carried. Everyone had their ghosts. The question was, could two people so haunted possibly find a way to live in the light? Outside, she heard the sharp crack of wood splitting. Calder was working through his anger with an axe. It was a familiar sound to her, but there was something else in his reaction that chilled her. It wasn't just grief, it was fear. The raw, primal fear of a man whose carefully constructed defenses had just been breached. She folded the recipe card and placed it on the table. She wouldn't hide it. She would face this. When she entered the barn, he was brushing down his horse, his movements sharp and violent. We need to talk, she said. Nothing to talk about. He didn't look up. There's everything to talk about. We can't live like this, pretending there isn't a ghost in every room of this house. He finally stopped, the brush still in his hand. What do you want me to do? Forget 5 years of my life. I want you to be honest, she shot back. You didn't marry me to move forward. You married me to stay exactly where you are. You brought me here to be a placeholder, another piece of furniture in your museum to a dead woman. The brutal truth of her words hung in the air. He finally looked at her, and she saw the raw, gaping wound he'd been hiding. Maybe, he said, his voice barely a whisper. But what about you? What are you running from, Rosalie? What kind of trouble made marrying a complete stranger seem like your best option? It was her turn to look away. The silence stretched. The unspoken secrets of two strangers, now bound together by law, but separated by walls of their own making. And what neither of them knew was that those walls were about to be tested, because the trouble Rosalie was running from was on its way. And it was far more dangerous than a lonely rancher's grief. Her question hung in the dusty air of the barn, a challenge he couldn't ignore. Fair question, Rosalie said, her hand instinctively going to the cameo brooch at her throat. She drew a shaky breath, deciding to give him a piece of the truth, but not all of it. Never all of it. My parents died when I was 15, she said, her voice quiet. I went to live with my mother's brother. They weren't kind people. When I turned 18, they arranged a marriage for me. To a man who would have been worse. The memory made her shiver. The mail order arrangement seemed like my only escape, my only chance at freedom. And now? Calder pressed, his own pain momentarily forgotten, replaced by a flicker of protective curiosity. Now I don't know what this is, she admitted, gesturing between them. But I know it won't work if we can't be honest with each other. He set down the brush, the anger draining out of him, leaving only a bone-deep weariness. Sarah died in winter, he said, his voice cracking. Lung fever. The last thing she said to me was, "Don't let the house die with me." She told me to keep living in it, not just existing. And have you? Rosalie asked gently. He shook his head, the admission costing him dearly. No, I've been existing, waiting, though I couldn't tell you for what. She took a tentative step closer. I can't be her, Calder. I won't even try. But maybe we can find something that's ours, instead of trying to live in the shadow of what you lost. He looked at her then, truly saw her. Not just a reminder of his past, but a woman of incredible strength who had survived her own untold horrors. A woman offering him a truce, a fragile, uncertain peace. All right, he said, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. We try again, as partners. Starting with Sarah's recipe box, she said, pushing him. He hesitated, then gave a slow, reluctant nod. Starting with the recipe box. A few days later, a fragile routine began to form. Rosalie, using Sarah's recipes, started to bring warmth and life back into the cold, silent kitchen. The smell of baking bread replaced the scent of dust and memory. Calder began to talk more, sharing stories about the ranch, about his father who had built it from nothing. They were two wounded animals, circling each other cautiously, learning to trust again. But the outside world wasn't going to leave them in peace. One morning, their neighbor, Frank Morrison, rode up to the house, his face grim. Calder, he said, dismounting, got some trouble. I'm missing a dozen head of cattle. Vanished without a trace. Rustlers? Calder asked, his posture instantly tensing. Feels like it, Frank said. Too clean. Too quiet. It's not the only thing either. There's a new fella in town, Ben Wheeler, buying up land like there's no tomorrow. He's been asking questions about your spread, asking if you might be looking to sell. The name sent a jolt through Rosalie. Wheeler, a man with a silver-detailed saddle, a man from a nightmare she couldn't quite place. Calder shook his head. This ranch isn't for sale. My father broke his back clearing this land. Sarah and I, we planned on our children growing up here. The mention of Sarah still carried a sting, but it was different now. A memory, not a ghost. Well, you tell him that, Frank said. But be careful. Fella gives me a bad feeling. After Frank left, Calder showed Rosalie more of the ranch, teaching her how to mend fences, how to read the clouds for weather. They worked side by side, the shared labor building a new kind of bridge between them. It was while they were fixing a gate on the eastern boundary that they saw him, a lone rider, approaching on a fine, expensive horse with a silver-detailed saddle. Speak of the devil, Calder muttered. That's Ben Wheeler. Rosalie froze. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him, the man from her dream, the man with the cold, calculating eyes. But it wasn't a dream. It was a memory she had buried deep, a memory from a dark chapter of her life she had prayed was over forever. Wheeler rode up, a broad, fake smile plastered on his face. Calder Holt, he boomed. Good to see you. And this must be the new Mrs. Holt I've been hearing so much about. His eyes swept over Rosalie, a flicker of something that looked like recognition in their depths, an appraisal that made her skin crawl. We didn't see the point in a long engagement, she said, her voice miraculously steady, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. When you know what you want, why wait? A practical woman, Wheeler said, his smile widening. I like that. In fact, I have a proposition for you two, a very generous offer for this land. Not interested, Calder said flatly. Don't be hasty, Wheeler chuckled. Times are changing out here. Small operations like this, they're finding it harder and harder to compete. Rustlers, bad weather. So many things can go wrong. The threat was veiled, but it was there, sharp and clear. As he turned his horse to leave, his eyes met Rosalie's one last time, and he gave her a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, a nod of acknowledgement, a nod that said, I know who you are, and I haven't forgotten. He rode away, leaving a thick, poisonous silence behind him. What was that? Calder asked, looking at her, his brow furrowed with concern. You went white as a sheet. Nothing, she lied, her mind reeling. He gives me a bad feeling. But it was so much more than that. Ben Wheeler wasn't just some land-grabbing stranger. He was a ghost from her past, a past she had fled across the country to escape. And he had just found her, her safe harbor, her marriage of convenience, had just become the most dangerous place on earth. That night, sleep offered Rosalie no escape. The image of Ben Wheeler's face, that cold flicker of recognition in his eyes, haunted her. She saw him not in Wyoming, but back in Pennsylvania. He had been a business associate of her uncle, a frequent visitor to their home, a man whose predatory gaze had always made her feel like a trapped animal. He had been there the night her uncle had sealed her fate, the night he'd promised her to the cruel, ancient Harold Crane. Wheeler had watched the whole transaction with a detached amusement, as if he were watching a horse being sold at auction, and now he was here. It couldn't be a coincidence. It was impossible. But what did he want? Was he working for Crane? Had her vengeful former fiancé sent this man to drag her back? The question swirled in her mind, a venomous cocktail of fear and confusion. She couldn't tell Calder. Not yet. He had just started to trust her, revealing that she was not just a woman fleeing poverty, but a fugitive from a powerful and dangerous man. It would destroy everything they were starting to build. It would prove his initial instincts right. He had invited trouble into his house, so she kept her secret locked away, a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The evenings had become a time of quiet comfort. Rosalie would mend clothes by the fire, while Calder, to her surprise, would carve small, intricate figures from scraps of wood. It was a peaceful habit, something his father had taught him. One night he was working on a small bird, a robin. Sarah used to say they were the first sign that winter was truly over, he said, the mention of her name now carrying a soft melancholy, not a sharp edge of pain. He handed it to her. The wood was smooth and warm from his hands. It was beautiful. It was beautiful work, she said, her fingers tracing the delicate feathers. As she handed it back, their fingers brushed. An electric spark of unexpected warmth shot up her arm. She saw something flicker in his eyes, a mirroring of the shock and curiosity she felt. This was new territory, a landscape more treacherous and exciting than any they had yet navigated. Their fragile peace, however, was about to be shattered. The rustling attacks grew bolder. Frank Morrison lost another 20 head. Another neighbor, Tom Bradley, had his prize bull slaughtered in its own pen, a clear and brutal message. The local ranchers organized patrols, riding the boundaries of their properties at night, armed and wary. The tension in the territory was a palpable thing, a low hum of fear and anger. Calder insisted on taking his turn, riding out into the cold, dark nights. And Rosalie, left alone in the silent house, felt the walls closing in. One night, while Calder was on patrol, she heard a noise outside. A horse moving quietly near the barn. Her heart leaped into her throat. Grabbing Sarah's small pistol from the desk drawer, a weapon Calder had insisted she learn to use, she crept to the kitchen window. In the pale moonlight, she saw a figure dismount and approach the barn, carrying what looked like a can of kerosene. It was one of Wheeler's men. the one named Jake Curtis. He was going to burn them out. Without thinking, fueled by a surge of adrenaline and a fierce, protective instinct she didn't know she possessed, Rosalie slipped out the back door. She moved through the shadows, the pistol cold and heavy in her hand. Curtis was splashing the kerosene against the dry barn wood, his back to her. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Rosalie said, her voice low and steady. Curtis spun around, his hand flying to the gun on his hip. But Rosalie was faster. She cocked the pistol, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the night. "Make a move and I'll shoot," she said, amazed at the calmness in her own voice. His eyes widened in the moonlight, seeing the small, determined woman holding a gun on him. "Mrs. Holt," he said, trying for a casual tone, "just checking on a loose fence board. Didn't mean to startle you." "You weren't checking a fence," Rosalie said, her eyes flicking to the kerosene can. "You were going to set a fire. Tell Mr. Wheeler that the Holt family doesn't scare so easily." A tense standoff ensued. The silence was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the frantic beating of Rosalie's heart. Finally, with a sneer, Curtis slowly raised his hands. He backed away, leaving the can behind, mounted his horse, and disappeared into the darkness. Rosalie stood there for a long time, shaking, the pistol still aimed at the empty space where he'd been. She had just faced down one of Wheeler's thugs. She had protected their home. But in doing so, she had crossed a line. She had declared war. When Calder returned just before dawn, he found her in the kitchen, the pistol and the kerosene can on the table. He listened to her story, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He walked over to her, and for a moment she thought he was going to be angry, that he would chastise her for the reckless danger. Instead, he reached out and gently took the gun from her trembling hands. Then he pulled her into an embrace, holding her tight against his chest. "You were brave," he whispered into her hair. "Incredibly brave." But as he held her, looking over her head at the kerosene can on the table, his eyes were cold as ice. The game had changed. This was no longer about stolen cattle or land offers. This was about his home, his wife. Wheeler had tried to burn them out. He had threatened Rosalie. And Calder Holt was about to show him what happens when you push a quiet man too far. The war wasn't coming anymore. It had just begun. The next few weeks were a cold war fought in the vast open spaces of Wyoming. Calder and Rosalie never traveled alone. The rifle was never far from his hand, and Sarah's pistol was a constant, comforting weight in the pocket of Rosalie's apron. They worked with Frank Morrison and the other ranchers, coordinating patrols, sharing information, creating a united front against Wheeler's creeping menace. But Wheeler was like a disease, infecting everything. The town's sheriff, a man named Thompson, suddenly became unhelpful, claiming the rustling was just a string of bad luck, and that there was no evidence to point fingers at a pillar of the community like Mr. Wheeler. It was clear he'd been bought. They were on their own. One afternoon, while cleaning the upstairs bedroom, a room she had slowly, carefully started to make her own, Rosalie's hand brushed against a loose floorboard under the large cedar chest. Curiosity piqued, she pried it up. Beneath it lay a bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. She recognized the elegant script immediately. It was Sarah's. Her first instinct was to put them back. These were private. Another ghost she shouldn't disturb. But something compelled her to untie the ribbon. She told herself it was to better understand the woman whose life she now inhabited, the woman Calder still grieved for. But the truth was, she was looking for a connection, for a sign that she wasn't just an imposter. The letters were drafts, copies of letters Sarah had written to her sister back in Pennsylvania. And as Rosalie read, the perfect, idealized image of Calder's first wife shattered into a million pieces. The letters were filled with a profound, aching loneliness and a desperate homesickness. "Calder works so hard," one letter read, "and I cannot bear to tell him how I miss the sound of church bells, or how this endless, empty land sometimes feels like a prison. He thinks I am so strong, but some days I feel as fragile as the china teacups Mother gave me, sitting unused because I'm too afraid they'll break." But then Rosalie's blood ran cold. The later letters took a darker turn. Sarah wrote of financial worries, of mounting debts that Calder knew nothing about. She'd made some bad investments with her inheritance, trying to surprise him, and had lost everything. And then came the most shocking revelation of all. A name appeared, woven into the fabric of her secret desperation. Ben Wheeler. Mr. Wheeler has been most attentive, Sarah wrote. He knows of our financial straits, though I don't know how. He has offered to buy the eastern pasture. It would solve everything. But Calder would never agree. His father's legacy is tied to every inch of this soil. Mr. Wheeler suggests I persuade him. His suggestions feel more like demands. Rosalie stared at the page, her mind reeling. Wheeler hadn't just shown up recently. He had been circling this ranch for years. He had known Sarah. He had been pressuring her, preying on her secret shame and desperation. Was it possible? The thought was too monstrous to form completely. Sarah had died of lung fever. Everyone knew that. It had been a terrible, swift illness. But what if it wasn't? What if the pressure, the fear, had contributed? Or what if Wheeler, impatient to get his hands on the land, had hurried things along? A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Rosalie looked up, her heart pounding, to see Calder standing in the doorway. His eyes weren't on her. They were fixed on the letters scattered on the bed. "You found them," he said, his voice hollow. There was no anger, only a deep, resonant sadness. He walked into the room and sank into the chair by the window. "I found the loose board years ago. I never looked. I think I was afraid of what I might find." "Calder," she began, her voice trembling. "There's something you need to know about Sarah and about Ben Wheeler." She told him everything. She read passages from the letters, her voice cracking as she revealed the secret burdens his first wife had carried alone. The homesickness, the lost inheritance, and Wheeler's relentless pressure. Calder listened in silence, his face carved from stone, his gaze fixed on the snow-covered prairie outside. When she finished, the silence in the room was deafening. He had built a shrine to a perfect marriage, a perfect wife. And in one afternoon, the foundation of that shrine had crumbled to dust. He hadn't just lost his wife to a fever. He had lost her long before that, to secrets and loneliness and the predatory circling of the very man who was now trying to destroy him. "She was trying to sell the land behind my back," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "She loved you," Rosalie said softly. "She was just lost and scared, and he took advantage of that." He finally turned from the window to look at her, and the raw pain in his eyes was like a physical blow. "All these years," he whispered, "I've been grieving a memory, a story I told myself. The real woman was suffering, and I never even saw it." In that moment of shared, shattering truth, the last wall between them dissolved. The ghosts of the past were no longer his alone or hers alone. They were theirs to face together. He reached out, his calloused hand covering hers. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was an anchor. "He didn't just try to steal my land," Calder said, his voice now dangerously low, laced with a cold, hard fury Rosalie had never heard before. "He preyed on my wife. He may as well have killed her." He stood up, a new, terrible purpose hardening his features. He was no longer just a man defending his property. He was a husband avenging a betrayal that had spanned years, a betrayal that had reached out from beyond the grave. And Rosalie knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this would not end with patrols and legal warnings. This would end in blood. Because Ben Wheeler hadn't just threatened their future. He had desecrated Calder's past. The fragile truce in the territory was shattered by a single, brutal act. One of the ranchers, Jim Hutchkins, a young man with a new wife and a baby on the way, was found dead on his own property. He'd been shot in the back while riding his own fence line. There was no proof, but everyone knew. It was Wheeler's work, a message. The time for talking was over. Fear was a poison arrow, and it had hit its mark. Some of the ranchers started to whisper about selling, about cutting their losses before they ended up like Jim. But for Calder, the murder was a clarion call. He would not be intimidated. He would not back down. He was fighting for more than land now. He was fighting for Sarah's memory, for Rosalie's safety, and for the soul of the community. But Wheeler wasn't done. His next attack was far more insidious, aimed directly at Rosalie. One morning, a man arrived at the ranch wearing a tarnished badge and claiming to be a territorial marshal. He handed Rosalie a sheaf of official-looking documents. It was a warrant for her arrest. The papers, filled with convoluted legal language, accused her of embezzling $300 from her uncle's store back in Pennsylvania. They claimed her flight west was an admission of guilt, and they were signed by a judge, ordering her immediate extradition to face charges. The man with the badge was Jake Curtis, the same man she'd faced down in the barn. He gave her a smug, triumphant smirk. "Looks like your past has finally caught up with you, Mrs. Holt," he said. "Your uncle has partnered with a Mr. Harold Crane. They've been very patient about recovering what's owed, but their patience has run out." Crane. The name was a punch to the gut. The monster she had fled. He had found her. It was a brilliant, vicious trap. The accusations were lies, but in a territory where the law was thin and easily manipulated, an official-looking warrant was as good as a conviction. Her reputation would be destroyed. Calder would be ruined by the scandal, and she would be dragged back east into the clutches of a man who considered her his property. When Calder returned and saw the papers, a cold, dangerous calm settled over him. He examined the document, his eyes scanning every line, every seal, every signature. Rosalie watched him, her hope dwindling. The papers looked so real. "It's a forgery," Calder said finally, his voice flat. "How do you know?" "The territorial seal is the old design. They changed it last year. And this judge," he tapped the signature at the bottom, "Judge Harrison, he died 3 months ago. This is dated last week." Relief washed over Rosalie, so potent it almost buckled her knees, but it was short-lived. "It doesn't matter if it's fake," she said, her voice shaking. "They have the power to make it real. Crane and Wheeler, they're working together. This isn't just about the land anymore. It's about me. Crane wants me back. Wheeler gets the ranch as a finder's fee." It was a two-pronged assault, designed to break them from the inside out. That afternoon, Wheeler himself rode up to the house, flanked by Curtis and 2 other hard-faced men. He didn't even bother with false pleasantries. "Holt," he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity, "I hear your wife has some legal troubles. A terrible thing. But I might be able to help. I've been contracted by certain parties back east. They're willing to be reasonable. You sign over the deed to this ranch, and perhaps I can persuade them to forget all about Mrs. Holt's indiscretions." "Get off my land, Wheeler," Calder said, his voice a low growl. "A foolish choice," Wheeler sighed, turning his horse. "I was offering you an easy way out. Now things will have to get complicated." He looked directly at Rosalie, his eyes filled with a chilling promise. "I'll be seeing you soon, my dear, one way or another." The threat was clear. The fake warrant was just the opening salvo. If they wouldn't surrender, Wheeler would simply take what he wanted. He would take the ranch, and he would take her. That night, sitting by the fire, the silence in the house was heavy with unspoken fear. Rosalie knew what she had to do. "You should let me go," she said softly, not looking at him. "This is my fight, my past. I brought this trouble to your door. If I leave, Wheeler has no more leverage. Crane gets what he wants, and you and the ranch will be safe." Calder got up from his chair and walked over to where she sat. He knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. He looked her directly in the eye, his gaze fierce and unwavering. "Listen to me," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she couldn't name. "You are not trouble I invited in. You are my wife. This is your home. That warrant, your past. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that we are in this together. There is no running. Not anymore. We stand here. We fight here. Together." And in that moment, something shifted between them. Something profound and irrevocable. It was no longer a marriage of convenience. It was no longer a partnership forged from necessity. Looking at the determination in his eyes, the unwavering loyalty, Rosalie finally understood. She wasn't just hiding in his house. She was home. And as Calder's hand tightened on hers, a single, terrifying thought echoed in her mind. This man, this stranger she had married out of desperation, was willing to die for her. And she, the woman who had spent her life running, was willing to do the same for him. The trip to Millbrook was a grim necessity. Armed with the forged warrant and Sarah's letters, Calder and Rosalie, accompanied by a determined Frank Morrison, rode to meet the circuit judge, a man named Patterson who was known for being honest, if overly cautious. They had to prove this wasn't just a rancher's dispute, but a coordinated criminal conspiracy. The town was buzzing with an unusual tension. Wheeler's men were everywhere, loitering outside the saloon, watching the courthouse steps. They weren't hiding. They were making a statement. Judge Patterson, a thin, scholarly man with sharp, intelligent eyes, listened to their story in his chambers. He examined the forged warrant with a professional's eye, immediately spotting the flaws Calder had pointed out. "This is a sophisticated piece of work," he admitted, "but a forgery nonetheless, a federal crime." Then Calder presented Sarah's letters. He watched the judge's face as he read about Wheeler's long-term harassment, his preying on a vulnerable woman. It was the missing piece, the proof of a long-standing, malicious intent. "These are serious accusations," Patterson said, his face grave. "Ben Wheeler is a man with powerful friends. To move against him, I need more than circumstantial evidence and letters from a deceased woman. I need direct testimony. I need proof that connects him directly to the rustling and the murder of Jim Hutchins." They left the courthouse with a small victory. The judge had officially declared the warrant fraudulent, but a larger sense of dread. Wheeler was too smart, too careful to leave a trail of evidence. As they stepped outside, Wheeler himself was waiting for them on the courthouse steps, a smug smile on his face. "I trust your business with the judge went well," he said, his voice oozing false concern. "Well enough," Calder replied, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle he carried. "Excellent," Wheeler said. "I do hope you understand that a minor legal misunderstanding doesn't change the economic realities of your situation." He let his gaze drift to Rosalie. "Accidents happen on isolated ranches in the winter, Mrs. Holt. It would be a tragedy for you to end up a widow twice in 1 year." From the courthouse doorway, Judge Patterson's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Is that a threat, Mr. Wheeler?" Wheeler's smile didn't falter. "Merely an observation about the harsh realities of frontier life, Your Honor." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. They had poked the hornet's nest. Wheeler was cornered, and a cornered snake is at its most dangerous. As they parted ways with Frank at the crossroads, Rosalie turned to Calder. "Whatever happens," she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength she hadn't possessed months ago, "I don't regret it. Choosing this life, choosing you." Calder reached across the wagon seat, his rough hand covering hers. "I was wrong before," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When I said I was just existing, these past few months with you, it's the most alive I've felt in years." The unspoken words hung between them, more powerful than any declaration. It was no longer about survival or convenience. They had, against all odds, found something real in the ashes of their former lives. They had found love. They arrived at the ranch just as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered fields in hues of blood and fire. And they saw it immediately. The smoke, a thick black plume rising from the direction of the barn. They raced the last quarter-mile, their hearts pounding in unison with the horses' hooves. The barn was engulfed in flames. Their winter hay, their tools, the stalls that housed their precious livestock. It was all going up in a roaring inferno. As they pulled the wagon to a halt, a shot rang out from the trees near the house. A bullet whizzed past Calder's head, splintering the wood of the wagon seat. They were trapped. Wheeler hadn't waited. He hadn't bothered with any more pretenses. While they were in town seeking justice, he had brought the war to them. Rosalie looked from the burning barn to the rifle in Calder's hands, to the dark shadows in the trees. The terror she had lived with for so long was gone, burned away by a cold, clear rage. They had taken her past. They had tried to take her freedom. Now they were trying to take her future. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers closing around the cool, familiar grip of Sarah's pistol. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady. Calder looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes. He saw not a frightened victim, but a warrior, his wife. "We fight," he said. "We make our stand. Right here, Right now." He helped her down from the wagon, and together they ran for the cover of the house, bullets kicking up snow at their feet. They slammed the door behind them, the roar of the fire and the crack of rifles filling the air. The siege had begun. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and their world was burning around them. But they were together, and they were home, and they would defend it to their last breath. The house became a fortress. They barricaded the doors with furniture, shattered the lower panes of the windows to create firing ports. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and gunpowder. Outside, the early dusk was illuminated by the hellish orange glow of the burning barn. Wheeler's men were ghosts in the twilight, their positions given away only by the sporadic flashes of their rifles. "How many?" Rosalie asked, reloading Sarah's pistol with steady hands, her movements precise and economical. "At least 6, maybe more," Calder replied from his position at the front window. "They're trying to pin us down, keep us from putting out the fire. By morning, we'll have nothing left but the house." "If we last till morning," she thought, but didn't say it. The futility of their situation was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. They had enough ammunition for a few hours at best. After that, a bullet slammed into the wall just above her head, showering her with plaster dust. She didn't flinch. Fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. They settled into a deadly rhythm, a flash from the trees, and they would return fire. They weren't trying to hit anyone, not yet. They were trying to survive, to make the cost of approaching the house too high. "They're burning our life's work," Calder said, his voice tight with a mixture of rage and despair, as he watched the barn roof finally collapse in a shower of sparks. "It's just a building," Rosalie said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "We're alive. That's what matters. We can rebuild a barn." He looked over at her, a look of profound respect and love in his eyes. In the midst of this chaos and terror, they had never been more connected, more of a single unit. But as the hours dragged on, their ammunition dwindled. The attackers grew bolder, their shots coming more frequently, striking the house with relentless, percussive force. They were being tested, worn down. Wheeler was patient. He knew time was on his side. Sometime after midnight, there was a lull in the shooting. The silence was more unnerving than the noise. "What are they doing?" Rosalie whispered. "Changing tactics," Calder muttered, his eyes scanning the darkness. "They're coming." And then they heard it, a scraping sound at the back of the house. Someone was trying to pry open the kitchen door. Rosalie's blood ran cold. She looked at Calder, her eyes wide. He nodded, his face grim. He would hold the front. The back was hers. She crept into the kitchen, the pistol held in a two-handed grip, just as he had taught her. The wood of the door groaned, splintering around the lock. With a final violent crack, the door burst open. A large, dark figure filled the doorway, silhouetted against the dying glow of the fire. It was Bill Haynes, one of Wheeler's most brutal thugs. He saw her, a dark smile splitting his face. He thought she was an easy target. He was wrong. Rosalie fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Haynes staggered back with a cry of pain and surprise, clutching his shoulder. He hadn't expected the quiet little wife to fight back. Before he could recover, she fired again. The second shot sent him stumbling back out into the snow, disappearing into the darkness. Trembling, Rosalie slammed the splintered door shut and leaned against it, her body racked with shudders. She had shot a man. She might have killed him. But there was no time for remorse. The assault on the back door had been a diversion. From the front of the house, she heard a crash of glass followed by Calder's roar of anger and pain. She raced back into the parlor to a scene of chaos. Two of Wheeler's men had smashed through the front window and were in the house. One was grappling with Calder, who was fighting with the savagery of a cornered bear. The other was advancing on her, a long knife gleaming in his hand. Time seemed to slow down. She saw the man's cruel eyes, the glint of the blade. She raised her pistol, her arm shaking. She squeezed the trigger. Click. Empty. The sound was the most terrifying thing she had ever heard. The man lunged. At that exact moment, the night erupted in a volley of gunfire from outside. Not the sporadic shots of Wheeler's men, but the coordinated, disciplined fire of a dozen rifles. The man with the knife stopped in his tracks, confusion on his face. The man fighting Calder was thrown backward as a bullet tore through his chest. Outside, shouts echoed through the night. "Drop your weapons, you're surrounded." It was Frank Morrison's voice. Through the shattered window, they could see them. Frank, Tom Bradley, and at least 10 other ranchers, appearing out of the darkness like avenging angels, their rifles blazing. Wheeler's men, caught completely by surprise, broke and ran. The siege was over. Frank Morrison burst through the door, his face a mask of fury and concern. "Calder! Rosalie! Are you all right?" Calder was slumped against the wall, a dark stain spreading across his sleeve. "Just a scratch," he grunted, though his face was pale with pain. Rosalie rushed to his side, tearing a strip from her apron to make a makeshift bandage. As their neighbors secured the area, finding 2 of Wheeler's men dead and another wounded, a new group of riders appeared. It was Judge Patterson, along with the real territorial marshal and 3 deputies. "We got your message," the judge said to Frank. "It seems Mr. Wheeler has finally made a fatal mistake." One of the deputies dragged a captured Jake Curtis into the house. The fake marshal's face was a mess of fear and defeat. "Where's Wheeler?" the marshal demanded. Curtis, seeing the jig was up, pointed a trembling finger toward the river. "He ran. Said he was heading for the pass." "He won't get far," the marshal said, turning to his deputies. "Let's go get him." As the lawman rode off in pursuit, Rosalie finished tying the bandage around Calder's arm. The immediate danger was over, but the adrenaline was still singing in her veins. She looked around the wrecked room, at the shattered windows and bullet-pocked walls. She looked at her husband, wounded but alive. And she knew that even though they had won the battle, the war wasn't truly over until Ben Wheeler was brought to justice. And she had a terrible feeling that there was one final, bloody chapter left to be written. The dawn broke on a scene of devastation. The barn was a smoldering ruin, a black, skeletal frame against the pink and gray sky. The house, though standing, was scarred and battered, a testament to the ferocity of the night's battle. Calder, his arm bandaged and throbbing, stood with Rosalie on the porch, watching as their neighbors helped to round up the last of Wheeler's captured men. The immediate sense of relief had been replaced by a grim, weary resolve. Judge Patterson approached them, his face etched with the gravity of the situation. "The marshal and his deputies are tracking Wheeler now, but I must be honest with you. He's a slippery man, and he knows his territory. There's a chance he could get away." "He can't get away," Calder said, his voice low and hard. "After what he's done, he has to answer for it." "And he will," the judge assured them, "but the law moves slowly, which brings me to another matter." He pulled a document from his coat pocket. "While my deputies were questioning Mr. Curtis, he became remarkably cooperative. It seems Mr. Wheeler kept meticulous records. A ledger. Curtis told us where to find it." He handed the ledger to Calder. It was a detailed accounting of Wheeler's entire criminal enterprise. Names, dates, payments, proof of the sheriff's bribery, a list of the cattle stolen from each rancher, payments to Harold Crane for information and services rendered in locating Rosalie. And something else. Something that made Calder's blood run cold. There were records of payments made to an informant. Someone local. Someone who had been feeding Wheeler information about the rancher's patrol schedules, their plans, their weaknesses. And the name listed next to the payments was a shock that hit Calder harder than any bullet. Tom Bradley, one of their own. One of the men who had ridden to their rescue. A man they had trusted. The betrayal was a bitter, sickening pill to swallow. Bradley had played both sides, feeding Wheeler information while pretending to be their friend, only joining the rescue party when he saw the tide was turning against his employer. It was a chilling reminder that the greatest danger often comes from the places you least expect. As they were absorbing this new treachery, one of the marshal's deputies rode back to the ranch at a full gallop. "We lost him," the deputy announced, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Wheeler's horse went lame near the canyon. He cut it loose and went up into the rocks on foot. The trail is too treacherous to follow in the dark. We'll have to wait for full light to go in after him." Calder looked toward the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, a desolate and unforgiving landscape. He knew that canyon. It was a maze of rocks and crevices, a perfect place for a desperate man to hide, or to make a final stand. He made a decision. I'm going after him, he said. Calder, no, Rosalie pleaded, grabbing his good arm. Let the law handle it. You're hurt. This isn't about the law anymore, he said, his eyes hard as flint. This is personal. He came after my wife. He came after my home. He preyed on Sarah. This ends now, between me and him. Judge Patterson and the marshal tried to argue, but they saw the unshakable resolve in his eyes. This was a reckoning that had been a long time coming. I'm going with you, Frank Morrison said, stepping forward, his rifle in his hand. Calder nodded, a silent acknowledgement of their long friendship. He turned to Rosalie. The look that passed between them was one of love, fear, and a deep, unspoken understanding. He was doing this for her, for them, for the future that had been so violently threatened. Be careful, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He kissed her then, a hard, desperate kiss filled with the intensity of the moment. I'll be back, he promised. Rosalie watched as Calder and Frank rode off toward the mountains, two determined figures against the vast, unforgiving wilderness. She was left behind, in the ruins of their home, to wait. The waiting, she realized, was its own special kind of torture. Hours passed like days. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Her neighbors, seeing the shock and exhaustion on her face, gently led her inside, cleaned her wounds, and began the grim task of cleaning up the wreckage of the parlor. But Rosalie couldn't rest. She paced the floor, her mind filled with terrifying images of Calder in those treacherous canyons, facing a desperate, cornered killer. Sometime in the late afternoon, they heard a rider approaching. It wasn't the marshal. It wasn't Frank. It was Calder. He was alone. He rode slowly, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. As he got closer, Rosalie's heart leaped into her throat. There was a second riderless horse trailing behind him. Slumped over its saddle, tied down with rope, was the body of Ben Wheeler. Calder dismounted, his face a grim mask of weary triumph. He didn't have to say a word. It was over. Truly over. Rosalie ran to him, throwing her arms around him, burying her face in his chest, her tears finally coming in a hot, cleansing flood. He held her tight, his one good arm a circle of safety and strength. That night, after the marshal had taken Wheeler's body and the last of the neighbors had gone home, they sat by the fire in their battered but unbroken home. The ledger sat on the table between them, a testament to the evil they had faced and conquered. What about Tom Bradley? Rosalie asked softly. He'll face justice, Calder said, his voice heavy. The judge will see to it. He reached across the table, taking her hand. It's all over, Rosalie. The threats, the running. It's done. She looked at him, at the man who had been a stranger just a few short months ago. The man who had saved her, who had fought for her, who had shown her what true love and courage looked like. She thought of the woman on the train station bench, alone and hopeless. And she thought of the woman she was now, a survivor, a fighter, a wife. We did it, she whispered. We did it together. Outside, the first snowflakes of a real winter storm began to fall, blanketing the scarred earth in a layer of pure, clean white. It was a symbol of a new beginning. They had faced the fire, and they had walked out of it together, stronger and more united than ever. Their future, once a terrifying uncertainty, now stretched before them, as wide and full of promise as the Wyoming sky. And if you enjoyed this story of survival, courage, and unexpected love, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the stories we have coming your way are only going to get more intense. And let us know in the comments, what was the biggest twist that caught you by surprise? Until next time, stay safe and always be ready to fight for what you love.